Jamie, I'm caught between the Jamies. Chellie and I are caught between the Jamies. But Jamie, thank you so much for such a very, very warm welcome. And it is my enormous honor and pleasure to introduce our two guests tonight. Chellie Pingree is the representative of the 1st Congressional District in Maine. And she cares about many of the things people here care about: organic farming, food system reform. She's been a defender and upholder of survivors of military sexual assault. She cares about the arts economy. She minds about the things that people on this island care about. And she's also a graduate of the College of the Atlantic. So, and one of my other favorite elements of her bio is she was a president of Common Cause. She knows that process of taking everyday people's concerns and getting them heard. So, a very warm welcome to Chellie. And with her, of course, we can hold the floor to you first. Jamie Raskin has the distinction of representing the 8th District in Maryland. Whoa, we have some Maryland. Montgomery County, Maryland, over here, I see. I'm not surprised, Washingtonians, I guess. Marylanders. Good point. Anyway, he actually, like my husband, was for 25 years a professor of constitutional law at American University in Washington. And, whoa, gosh. And of course, he was the lead impeachment manager of the 2nd impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, and also served on the Select Committee to investigate the January the 6th assault on the Capitol buildings. So, Jamie, a very, very warm welcome to the College of the Atlantic. We met each other at the airport a little earlier on and drove in, and I brought him onto this campus, and he was immediately stunned by the beauty of the place and the sense of energy and inspiration that comes from it. So I wanted to start by telling the two of you who've just got here this afternoon that this tent has been full twice a day all this week with people who've been grappling with this big question, questions of democracy. And Jamie, I want to ask you right off the bat, what's at stake here? Why do people need to care, and why do they care?
Well, Francis, first of all, thank you for your warm introduction. Hello, College of the Atlantic. Hello, Maine. Delighted to be here. And if we're talking about democracy, I'm glad it's a big tent. Because democracy is the system that we all take care of together. And those of us, like the great Chellie Pingree and me, who aspire and attain to public office, are nothing but the servants of the people. And the moment that we begin to act not like servants of the people, but like monarchs and kings and queens and czars and emperors and empresses and people collecting fancy emoluments and titles and all that, that is the moment to evict, eject, reject, and start all over again. And so, you know, it's like the other Jamie was saying, America was founded as an experiment. I mean, before the American revolutionaries got into it, everybody for all of human history, with the possible and very discrete and limited exception of Athenian democracy, but everybody had lived under dictators and strongmen like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban and General Xi and Donald Trump, and that was the fate of humanity. And the American revolutionaries said, with a big push from Tom Paine, let's think bigger than that. Let's make the tent a lot bigger than that. Why don't we base government on what Jefferson would come to describe as the consent of the governed in the Declaration of Independence, and why don't we guarantee freedoms and liberties to the people? And so every other government had been founded on the word of God and the bequest of God to the king. And how did we know that? The king told us so, right? But America turned it upside down and began our constitutional experiment with those three beautiful ringing words, we the people, right? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty, do hereby ordain and establish the Constitution. It didn't mention God. It established the separation of church and state. It said there would be no religious test for public office. And so they wanted to demystify politics and say, everybody's invited in, let's make it government of the people. Now, of course, it wasn't perfect by a long shot, and we didn't live up to our ideals, but the ideals that Jefferson put into the Declaration and that appear in the Constitution became the standard by which America would be judged. Like Dr. King said, all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. And that has been the motive force for change in our history. And if you read the Constitution the way that I do, the vast majority of the amendments that we've had since the original Bill of Rights, since the original 10, the vast majority of the 17 have been democratizing amendments that have moved us towards a more perfect union, right? The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection. The 15th Amendment bans race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of election of the US senators from the legislature to the people. The 19th Amendment doubles the franchise in America by giving women the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment says people in Washington, D.C. can participate in presidential elections. 24th Amendment bans poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. So the whole movement of American history has been towards greater democracy. So that's what's at stake in this election in 2024. Are we going to lapse into some other kind of government like the autocrats in Moscow or the theocrats in MAGA or the plutocrats and kleptocrats in Mar-a-Lago want us to do? Or will we continue the great experiment and journey and mystery of democracy for the people? That's the question.
That's what's at stake. Chellie, I watched you listening to that answer, and I think of you, you have such extraordinary experience in state politics in this particular state, and you deal with people who are thinking about payroll and feeding their families, and you've worked in small businesses yourself. So how do you take these lofty ideals, I have to say they're big ideas, right, and talk about them and persuade people about them in your area and across the state?
Yeah, and I would agree with Jamie that, you know, everything is at stake in this election. We're all prone to saying this is the most important election of our lifetimes, but this one is, okay, it really is. And you're right, I get my experience from, you know, living in a very small town in Maine. And many of you are either living here or you come here to visit in the summer or you're having a wonderful vacation. And you sort of know how the fabric of our state is woven together by these small communities. We're one of the most rural states in the nation. We have almost 500 small towns, and each one has a board of select people and a school board and a tax assessor and a board of planning board and the board of appeals, all these things. And each one of them is so dependent on these fundamentals of democracy. When I first got involved in the state legislature, I wasn't even registered in a party. I didn't have this sense of I'm a partisan player and here's who I'm from. I, you know, live on the island of North Haven, 417 people, and we're proud of every one. And when I first got there, you know, outsiders weren't very well revered. As we all know, if you're not born in Maine, you know, you got to wait a long time. And I have a long story about that I won't get into. But our form of government was town meeting, and so many towns are that. The first Saturday in March, you all get together. Town meeting is a fundamental form of government. Everything is written on the warrant, every budget item. You know, how much will you put into the roads? How much will you pay, you know, for every little item? And people show up and participate. And it was the best civics education I could possibly get, because I fundamentally understood that if everybody gets a chance to stand up and say something in a room, you know, half the size or whatever your town is, then they felt fully invested in the democracy. They felt fully invested in it. They could have their argument, you could vote on it, everything could happen. And the same with running for those small town elections. And I started out, I like to say, I started as a tax assessor because it was one job nobody else wanted, and I knew I could win. 20 years later, I got to the school board, and that was my goal, you know, be on the school board when my kids are in school, and they weren't as sort of nasty and weird as they are now. But what I'm trying to say is, each one of those things is part of this fundamental of democracy. And you're now seeing, you can read in the paper a school board that's having a horrific fight about things that are sort of coming from the outside. Should we ban certain kids in bathrooms, or are we going to ban books, or things that sort of don't belong here but feel like they're part of the bigger political agenda. And each one of those sort of cuts away at your ability to talk to your friends and neighbors or be civil with each other. And that's just so fundamental. So we've got this complicated thing that goes on in Congress, and we've got a terrifying election coming up about whether, we will be a dictatorship or whether we will stick with all the fundamentals that my colleagues and I worry about every day. But I just feel like if we let too much of that erode, we're also eroding each little community and each little state and this fundamental sense of responsibility that we all feel to participate and work for the common good. And I think the fundamental, key to America being good is this understanding of we're all in it together. And the day we lose that, the day we let that erode completely, we're just done. And that's what you kind of see in this, on the federal level when we fight against SNAP benefits or, reasonable priced housing or all the things that make people's lives work. And it's what happens if your town falls apart and your community can't work together, because then, you don't speak to each other in the local store, or you don't help somebody with a flat tire, or you don't let your kids go play at that person's house because they're on the wrong side.
So we were invited here today to talk about rebuilding goodwill and collaboration in the House, which hasn't been a kind of icon of civility in the past few years. And I really want to ask you how possible it is to even, is it naive to even have those goals when you're working with people who have condoned storming the Capitol building? Jamie.
Well, I think that's the right question because, most of us, or a lot of people here, grew up at a time where we had two parties, but I remember there was a time when people used to criticize the two parties for being too much alike.
Right.
They were too similar.
Yeah.
And you really could get along. And even when I was a state senator for a decade in Annapolis, and I ran for Congress, and I went back and looked at all my bills, like the vast majority of them had bipartisan support, and even unanimous bipartisan support. Things like, even like abolishing the death penalty, we had bipartisan support. Even marriage equality, we had bipartisan support. The National Popular Vote, Interstate Compact, things like that. But things have changed. The political scientists tell us that an authoritarian political party is one that bears certain characteristics, okay? And one is they don't accept the outcome of democratic elections that don't go their way, okay? Two, they embrace or they refuse to disavow political violence as an instrument for obtaining and maintaining political power. Three, they're organized as a cult of personality around one charismatic or allegedly charismatic figure whose word is elevated above the rule of law and above the Constitution. And fourth, they use to organize people, not bipartisan or nonpartisan, multi-partisan efforts to advance the common good, but rather scapegoating, fear-mongering, racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, immigrant bashing, and so on, and everybody got mad at our great president, Joe Biden, for saying that there were semi-fascist currents running through what used to be Abraham Lincoln's party. But I'm sorry, if the shoe semi-fits, you semi-wear it, okay? Because those characteristics are present. So, but I'll tell you a story, because I'm a middle child, and I like to bring people together, like, I don't know if I got some fellow middle children out there, and I always like to make friends across the aisle and across party lines. When I first got elected, and I got elected to Congress the same night that Donald Trump got elected president, and so we took office together. And there was a guy who I liked very much from Texas, from Corpus Christi, named Lamar Smith, who was the chairman of the House Science Committee. And you remember Lamar, right,
Yep.
Chellie? And I thought, like maybe we could be friends. He had introduced himself to me, and he was the chair of the House Science Committee, and so I thought, okay, he's not totally caught up in the whole MAGA thing. And one day we were sitting together in the Judiciary Committee, and I said to him, Lamar, we can disagree about abortion, and we can disagree about corporate taxes and stuff, but on climate change, you guys have got to really get serious about this because it's the whole future of our species that's, on the line. And he said, well, Jamie, he said, you got your scientists and we got our scientists, And I said, well, that's not how science works, right? I represent NIH and FDA and NOAA, and we were sitting in front of a computer, and I went to the computer. I said, let's look at all of the websites for these great scientific installations in Maryland's beautiful 8th district. And so we went, and all of them have a whole section about climate change, how it's affecting their work. And I said, see, all of the professional scientists agree that climate change is real. And, if our brains were bigger, if we were smarter, this is all we would be working on right now, is how to save ourselves from these, mounting calamities taking place all over the world. And he said, well, Jamie, he said, I don't want to get in a big fight with you, but he said, let me tell you this about professionals. He said, professionals built the Titanic, amateurs built Noah's Ark. Okay, now think about that for a second, all right? It took me a moment to digest that. And I said, well, do you want an amateur flying you back to Texas this weekend? Or are you saying you just want two members of our species to survive? Or, but that was the moment I realized, like, we can make friends. We can be civil.
Right.
But there are some fundamental differences of a civilizational emergency nature that mean we have to exercise our rights as democratic citizens and organize and win. Now, the postscript to the story, though, is I did get an email from Lamar in 2018, and he said, and I started sending him all these books by Bill McKibben and all the climate change books, and he sent me this email, and he said, please check this out. And there were two attachments, and one was to an article, I think, in the Austin Statesman that said, Lamar Smith makes speech on climate change, in which he acknowledged the weight of the scientific findings, that climate change is real. He wasn't sure if it was, caused by human beings or some other cause, but he did think it was something that needed to be addressed. The second article was connected to, I think, the Dallas Morning Herald, and it said, Lamar Smith announces retirement from Congress. Okay, so, political parties are real things.
Right.
And, I'm not somebody who denounces political parties, because the alternative to political parties and the much reviled partisanship is a one-party state. You don't like partisanship, go to Russia. Vladimir Putin's taking care of it. There's no partisanship there. Look at Alexei Navalny. He's killed because he was trying to stand for a different political party. You can get rid of partisanship only by getting rid of the oxygen of democratic society, which is freedom of speech, freedom of association, and people's right to disagree. And there's nothing to be afraid of with disagreement, as long as you're not disagreeing with a party that wants to destroy the whole constitutional order.
A lot of the dialogue that we listen to, the public dialogue we listen to, is hostile, frankly insulting. What's it like behind the scenes, Chellie? I mean, is there a more civil, how much of this is theater?
I think
Produced for all of us. And
Yeah,
do
no,
you
no.
see something very different on it?
I think a tremendous percentage of this is theater played out by increasingly good performers. And so I came to Congress in 2009. Jamie came in 2016 with Trump. So I had the 8 years of the Obama administration. I even had some years in the majority when we were able to move through things like the Affordable Care Act. Now we only won it by one vote, but we were able to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I was editing those stories.
But what I've seen change, and I think, okay, so what I've seen change is that it was far easier to do bipartisan work in a previous era. And without spending too much time talking about Donald Trump, he changed a lot. He changed how it's allowable to speak about each other. He changed the kind of power and hold he had over the party. It was no longer the Republican Party. It's become sort of Trump's party. And we've seen it in things like the border deal that got negotiated by Senator Langford, very conservative senator from Oklahoma, all worked out in the Senate, plenty of goodwill. And then you get that call and all of a sudden you're off of it, like you can't do it. And I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and Congress is, very full of itself, and we love to say they're Republicans and Democrats and appropriators. And appropriators, we get in a room with each other and we're supposed to be able to work out a deal. And honestly, we worked out a lot of deals and we were able to put things together. But I noticed my Republican colleagues every year starting to say more and more, I'm with you on that, but I don't want to have a primary, so I'm not going to vote with you. And you can sort of stand back and say, like, get on your high horse. And there's like, well, then you don't belong in politics. Well, you know what? It's really hard when the party increasingly gets to this sort of bullying stage and you can just barely hang on to your seat. And you're thinking, well, if I vote too many times in the wrong way, then I give it to the really bad guy who's going to be so much worse. So that's a whole nother kind of debate. But I have seen that change. And I feel like I have a lot of Republicans that I do work with. And I'm 100% with what Jamie said. I don't want to be like, this is different, but I think outside forces and one particularly strong, whatever he is, a despot who has the ability to kind of bully people into doing things that even they in their guts don't think is right. I just finished debating the Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill on the floor, and that's about 10 hours of debate, much of it on climate change. They want to ban electric cars. They want to drill. They want to change, they want to go back to another era, which is sort of unthinkable, especially in a crowd like this or at this college. But I feel like when they get up and do their talking points, it's not deep and from the heart. It's not from a place of scientific knowledge. It's sort of, bashing the Biden administration for trying to, stop using oil and gas in these cars that, don't really work well. And there's no, they're just always going through stuff that like they read on the internet or it's from a meme. And so the question of whether this is performance is a good one, because that's what I look at. Like they're acting sometimes out in a play where you have to perform in a certain way. Now, fixing that is complicated. And I think fixing it has something to do with who we are in Congress and how we behave with each other. But I think there is a sort of deep undercurrent of people who want to believe they came there to do the right thing on both sides of the aisle and want to believe that they're going to accomplish good things in their life. There's a certain group that is only playing to the president and how can they to the former president. And then I think there's just this really difficult problem we're controlled by in this country, and that's social media and memes and disinformation and misinformation. And I'll just say one more thing about it, because I'm really focused on climate change. If we had passed some of the bills we tried to pass in 2009 related to renewable energy, this country would be in a completely different place. We lost those. And some of that I put on the Democrats for not realizing what was to come if we didn't get that done. But since then, you try to do anything related to renewable energy, and there's a huge fight, whether it's wind or solar or biodigesters. And a lot of it comes from a place of no science, just lack of information. And so even your constituents, even the most friendly environmental people I know are sometimes coming up to me and saying like, well, I'm not going to get an electric car because you know where the batteries come from, or I don't like wind power because they can't recycle the blades, or solar panels all come from China and all these things. And you're like, whoa. I admit we got some problems we're still working out, but you're talking about fossil fuels and we're in the hottest summer on record. Like this isn't something we get to turn around on. So anyway, long way of saying, I have a lot of colleagues that I work well with and who I know fundamentally believe that, but they have very little power in this Congress, and the rules and the leadership cut them off the knees if they really try to move forward, or sometimes even work with the Democrat. It's a very different place in that way.
So, Jamie, can Congress ultimately unite around protecting its own safety and the fundamental institutions of the United States? I mean,
does the date January 6th mean anything to you?
Absolutely does. I'm going to talk about that.
Let me
to reflect after.
Well, let me first advance an optimistic thesis, and then I want to just add a structural postscript to Chellee's point. I mean, Maine is now my 23rd state that I've been to in this campaign. And this is not a campaign event. I'm not compromising anybody's 501c3 status or anything. But the vast majority of the people reject authoritarianism and reject know-nothingism and conspiracy theory and insurrectionism and collaboration with Vladimir Putin and dictators around the world, the vast majority of the people. So why are we in this situation of such extreme party polarization. And I think Chellie mentioned it in passing, which is, well, if I don't do exactly what I'm being told to do, like I was for the bipartisan border immigration bill until Donald Trump called and said, no, I don't want a border solution. I want a border crisis to run against in the campaign. And if I don't go along with that, I'm going to get somebody that they're going to put up against me in the primary. Why are we in the situation we're in when we have such a vast majority of people who agree on all of the basic issues? America's a pro-choice country, for example. America wants to have a universal violent criminal background check. America wants to get rid of AR-15s and assault weapons as weapons of mass destruction in the streets. But so why are we so deadlocked? Well, we've got to look at the structural mechanics of our political system. And there is, a political party that is thriving on the gerrymandering of our congressional districts and our state legislative districts. And it makes everything more extreme and it makes everything less representative. And so we're still dealing with an obsolete architecture. I mean, look at it's 2024. How about it's time to elect the president of the United States the way we elect governors and representatives and senators and mayors? Whoever gets the most votes wins, right? So, we've had 5 popular vote losers become president twice in this century, in 2000 and 2016. The vast majority of Americans are completely marginalized and sidelined in the general election campaign because we live in safe red states or safe blue states. And everybody knows the 7 or 8 states that are really swing states where your vote counts. I think Maine is still kind of at least the second district is
right.
one district. But I mean, if we had a system where every vote counted and every vote counted equally, we would not get all of these bizarre strategic machinations just devoted to Pennsylvania and Arizona and Michigan. They would be campaigning all over America, right? The turnout is like 8 to 10 points higher in swing states than it is everywhere else because there's real campaigns going on there. So I think we do have to look at the political science.
Right.
And our framers were all about that, right? Jefferson said he deplored the sanctimonious reverence with which some people hold the original handiwork of the framers. He said, I knew them, I was with them, they're great people, but they were no wiser than you or I. And we have the benefit of the experience of all the decades to take place in between. So we've got to use our minds to say, let's get out of a situation where we're stuck with voter suppression, gerrymandering of our districts, right-wing judicial activism, the electoral college, the filibuster, all of these things that are the opposite of democracy. And so I'm with John Dewey, who said, John Dewey said that the only cure to the ills of democracy is more democracy. And what we're suffering from today is not democracy, but the obstacles and the impediments to it, to the popular will.
Sally, I want to ask you a little bit more about the strategies you use in Congress for bipartisanship, how you reach, and whether they've changed from those Obama years to now, whether there are any new strategies emerging about how you go about your work.
Well, I do think our work is much harder really since 2016.
Right.
And, but I will say, some of it is simple. And I'm sure Jamie has the same kind of stories. I've found some of the Republican colleagues that I can work with by getting to know each other because we, traveled to Poland, to other countries together to see what was going on in Ukraine. And sometimes it's just simple because you're on the committee with somebody. One of my favorite stories is Thomas Massey, who's a very conservative colleague of ours, but sometimes libertarian. We used to plug our cars into the same post, just like a little plug in the garage.
He has an electric car.
He has an electric car. And he's from Kentucky. And I just want you to know, I was driving a Chevy Volt and he had a Tesla. I live in a net zero all solar home, and he lives off the grid in Kentucky, and he raises his own animals, and I'm, an organic farmer. And so we started, sharing little videos on the floor of the chicken tractor that he uses to put his chickens in and all these things. And so we have this kind of bond, and we sometimes do farming panels together, or we fight for the right to drink raw milk, or, things like that. Like we join up. And so we have this kind of bond, but I can't necessarily convince him to change his mind on some of this big picture stuff. Or, he had a Trump opponent because he did some very, more like minorly moderate things. Last year, I brought the House Agriculture Committee up here, and Jim Baird, one of my colleagues from Indiana, got to come out and see a aquaculture operation, or visit my farm and, eat what we produce. And it sort of changed our relationship, being able to do those things together. So I think we all have that tried and true strategy. And sometimes people will say, like, well, why don't you just take some Republicans and go get a beer? And going to get a beer and talking about your kids, or traveling on a trip where you have something in common, really can bring you together. And often those are the times when people sitting around, in a foreign country eating dinner, they'll say terrible things about Donald Trump. They'll say terrible things about, some of the things that we're having to deal with. But I think what Jamie said, that the structural issues that we're dealing with in our election cycle, and he did leave out money in politics. And, that's fundamental. The outside influences of money in election campaigns is off the charts now. Makes it much harder to participate. But I also think, we have to get ourselves away from this current leader. I really do think sometimes you can have a bad leader of a party who continues to poison things, and it works down through. I mean, one other little thing about the actual, how the House works, as you've known, we've gone through a few speakers. Like, we can't seem to, on the other side, they've had a hard time doing that. And in the course of doing that, they gave out all kinds of things that interfered with the structure of the House to the Freedom Caucus. And by and large, the members of the Freedom Caucus, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and these members, they don't care about governing. They like chaos. They make a lot of money. They raise a lot of money on their internet sites because they're outrageous and say terrible things and insult us all. But they also, in getting what they wanted, they negotiated with Kevin McCarthy, who was running for Speaker at the time, to put 3 members on the Rules Committee, 3 members on the Appropriations Committee. And I can tell you, the debate in the Appropriations Committee changed from that day forward, because these are the people who get up and say, we shouldn't ban Confederate monuments. We should go back and put them all up again because it's destroying our history. Or climate change isn't real. Or you got to abolish the Department of Education. And when they interfere with some of the few committees that were bipartisan, or rules that has to function and decide what our process will be every day, you can hardly operate the House anymore because they're just constantly obstructionists. And we know the only pieces of legislation that we've gotten passed, and good on us for being able to do it, was last year's the appropriations bill, after we just tore it down, started over again, said this won't pass the Senate, and everybody went into a different little room and said, okay, we're not going to include those guys, we're just going to get it done. So we can do that, and we will have to do it again this year if we're going to keep government open. But we have destroyed so much of the structure right now. And I do think, again, I don't want to pin my hopes on the day that, Donald Trump isn't controlling the party, but because he could have a clone that comes right after him. But
He could have a Donald Trump Jr., for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I do think, like, he is unique. It's a unique moment in time when people are frustrated and angry about government. He's sort of caught the wave in a way of saying, like, I'm with you, they're not with you. There's a lot of underlying themes going on that people are frustrated about. And sometimes he uses them to his own gain instead of improving public policy.
So why are people so frustrated? Why is it so of the moment to criticize expertise and institutions? Jamie, what has Trump tapped into that you recognize when you're out talking to people?
Well, I would identify a couple of things. One is what Chellie was talking about in terms of the social media, and I don't think we've even begun to grapple with what the effects of the internet and social media are on child development, on emotional and mental health, on people's relationship to facts and science and so on. And, we're dealing with a worldwide movement of authoritarian assault on democratic institutions and on liberalism, right? Their paragon for government today is Viktor Orban and Hungary's illiberal democracy. What is illiberal democracy? It is elections without rights and freedoms. That's the very opposite of what Lincoln thought the relationship was, right? When he got up on the battlefield in 1863, and he said 70 years ago, that's 87 years subtracted from 1863. It takes you back to 1776, the Declaration. And, all of the conservatives, pro-slavery apologists for the time were saying, why is he talking about the Declaration of Independence? What about the Constitution? Everybody talked about the Constitution. And he said, well, no, the Constitution, like the Articles of Confederation, like the Articles of Association, were just one more iteration of a working draft for a government. But the Declaration, with Jeffersonian promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the consent of the governed, and all men, we would say today, and all women being created equal, that was the promise of America. So he said that constitutional democracy is like the beautiful silver platter upon which rests the golden apple of freedom, which means that freedom is really what we're seeking in life and in government. Democracy is necessary. It's not sufficient, as African Americans and other people who've been oppressed in our history know. You can have democratic institutions that coexist with slavery and discrimination and Jim Crow and so on. But democracy gives you the chance of forward motion and making change, as Dr. King said. So we need to make sure that democracy and freedom are held together. That's why I'm so proud of the nominee. I think as of today, she got the requisite number of delegate votes of my party. Vice President Harris, who said the theme of her campaign is freedom. And surely freedom has got to be the dominant theme. And I was reflecting when, Chellie, when you talked about the Confederate monuments. One of our former colleagues, Trey Gowdy, once invited me to go to a Confederate battle reenactment. And I said, as long as they're not using live ammunition, I'm happy to go. So yeah.
They love that.
Yeah,
They
so,
love
yeah.
that.
Or on social media, I would argue that every new form of communication, back to the printing press, pamphleting, radio and TV has been associated with huge political upheaval. Look at radio and TV and the rise of communism and fascism. So is this a sort of passing phase, or are things moving so rapidly now? Generative AI is going to produce images that are not going to let you believe your own eyes very soon.
I was reading the paper the other day, and there were two articles that pointed in exactly opposite directions on your question.
Yeah.
One was Vladimir Putin and his intelligence service. I always forget what the new KGB is called, but whatever.
Yeah.
He, used to be head of the KGB, but that they are scraping through people's Facebook pages and their social media accounts in Ukraine and Czechoslovakia and Poland to look for people who are alienated and discontented. They feel passed over for a job promotion or whatever. And then they're sending their intelligence agents to those people to see whether they'll go to work for Russia, right? And that's just a really depressing thought in thinking about how the internet works. But then there was an article on the next page in the Washington Post about what's taking place in Afghanistan and how women under the Taliban, of course, have been completely subjugated and oppressed and disempowered and kicked out of school and so on. But they have found a space for communication and dialogue on the internet,
Right.
where they get
Both
together.
those things can be true, right?
Yeah.
And so like the telephone, like television and radio,
Yeah.
it's up to us what we're going to do with them. And it does seem like the misanthropes and the reactionaries always get a hold of the technologies first, but don't bet against democracy, because we're coming back in this election in 2024. So,
Chellie, tell me about what the internet does to island life. I mean, it must have changed the essence of life on North Haven and your political organization.
Well, it's funny. I think people in small towns still very much value the, chatting with somebody in the post office or meeting up at the general store. We do have a Facebook page for our town, and I think a lot of little towns do. And, people say like, I got a ferry reservation for sale, or there's a, something going on at school. So, I mean, it has that kind of impact. And I think Maine is trying our best to kind of hang on to the things we value about rural life, community life, and, being with each other. And a lot of people naturally are here because they're a little bit of a Luddite, they're not interested in constantly checking their phone and those kinds of things that we do all the time. I will say, I think you've got a good point, because we can all remember when there were, partisan papers and, and when they first appeared and, so many things you've already illuminated. But I think part of what you have to say is nefarious use of the latest media. And one of the problems is, I worked at Common Cause when we were very engaged in sort of the fairness doctrine and the changes that were going on in media with cable coming in and not complying with the same laws that the networks do. And we're all old enough to say, like, oh, wasn't it great when we had Walter Cronkite and 3 networks and they all told the truth? But there's something to that Congress cannot keep up with, because we're incapable of dealing with the complexity of the problem. It's not that we shouldn't be, but we're of some of the things that we're supposed to regulate on the internet now or on AI. It's very hard for us to do. And so what I'm saying about the nefarious players are the same players that used to play when I was in the State House in Maine, and the outside group would lobby you from the oil and gas industry, or the bankers, or anybody who wanted to get what they wanted, and we'd call it grass tops, because we'd say, well, these aren't really grassroots organizations, but they would pretend they were. And they would convince you that they had enormous numbers of members, and that's how they'd get you. Well, the internet can do that in such a beautifully secret way. Put this information into your feed, and then you can't remember where you saw it, and it sticks in your mind. You're like, no, I just read this thing about offshore wind, and this is why you can't have it, or why, climate change isn't real, because I saw it just shows these cycles and it's going to cool off tomorrow, or we had a cold day, so it must be okay. But I'm just saying, and the millions of dollars. I mean, I work in the food system and really try to change policy and deal with some of the issues that we have, and especially huge issues like food is medicine, the fact that our increasing problems with the foods that we eat are driving up our healthcare costs, which is a huge expense for Congress and all of us. And people don't understand that food processors in the agriculture system spends more money lobbying Congress than the defense industry. Like, you don't realize, but they're there everywhere and everything. We're talking about maybe we should regulate ultra processed foods. Well, just watch a flood of money pour through the door, and all of a sudden, your colleagues have been convinced by somebody like, I got a packing plant in my district, I can't do that. So now they can do that through the internet. They can convince our colleagues, and our colleagues, not just our colleagues, but our constituents write us and say, no, I got this information. The amount of money the oil and gas industry is paying to create disinformation campaigns around climate change is far beyond our level of understanding and having the biggest impact.
So I want to ask you more about mainstream media and reporting. I've done science reporting. I've run our science section, and I've done political reporting. And in science reporting, you look for the preponderance of evidence, right? We don't have a flat earth view every time we talk about geography. It's just not relevant. In politics, there's much more of a tendency to have a he said, she said. You have the Republican view and the Democratic view. And after 2016, there was a lot of soul searching about that. Do you hold mainstream media responsible for elevating irresponsible views in any way, or entertaining views or outrageous views in a way that you think may have damaged democracy?
Well, I think a lot of the newspapers address that problem. They've been cleaning up their act. I mean, of course, the underlying premise was wrong, that there's 2 sides and only 2 sides to every issue, and one is right and one is wrong, or we're agnostic between the two. I mean, both parties could be lying, right? That's not inconceivable. I think that journalism much more today is trying to chase the truth and get to the truth, and not just in a lazy way say, well, the Democrats said this and the Republicans said that.
Or there's more weighted evidence on one side or the other. But
yeah,
I mean, this is massively expensive, reporting to do the fact checking that people do now. We have a visual forensics team now to check on photos before we put them out.
I do think, in defense of the internet, that the proliferation of news sources and the ability that, all of us could be like Tom Paine, all of us could be a journalist proclaiming the little bit of reality that we see with our own eyes has been a good thing. And I think that the internet, ultimately, if it doesn't end up pandering and reinforcing people's most sadistic impulses, could become the end of war. because you look at the young generation today and they are seeing images of war from all around the world, and it is turning them in a very strong way against the militarization of every problem. And they are really trying to promote peace and diplomacy. So,
Chellie, is that something you see again? I want to take you back to Maine and to ground us in Maine, these trends that Jamie is reflecting on across the country.
I do think that, I do think there's a good and a bad side of the internet. And I do think it's opened up people to far more information and opportunities and conversations and discussions. And we've been privileged in Maine because I think there's been a lot of emphasis on reinforcing traditional media, keeping the papers strong, keeping newspapers, which are, not that everybody picks up the newspaper, but they're often the source of information for what somebody posts and that's part of what you need is that factual information. But you've made a very important point. It's expensive. And increasingly, it's hard to get, locally owned newspapers don't survive very well. And then they get bought up by somebody else who starts to cut the newsroom. And it takes a lot of work and investigative reporting and digging around. So
most investigative reporting ends in failure. I mean,
yeah, but it's still so essential. And I do think people believe strongly in it. And if you ask a lot of Mainers who live here around, they would say, I turn on the local news at night. I watch the news that comes on to see the weather or what's, going on in my community. And by and large, those tend to be sources of sort of good information with a little bit of, good local information with a little national stuff thrown in. So still important to what we do.
I can see we're going to have some questions from the audience in 1 second, but Jamie, I do have one question before we go to that. And that comes off my experience out reporting. And I often meet people who have opposing views of America, and they're equally convinced that their view is right, and it's the essence of America. You once said that you didn't want to be at the political center, you wanted to be to represent the moral center. How do you define what the moral center is, and that your moral center is all these other people's moral center, and the people out there's moral center?
Well, that story comes from
quote?
No, not at all. I just want to contextualize it. That I was with my first campaign for office, and I was running for state senate against a 32-year incumbent who had introduced a pro-Iraq war resolution, who was championing the death penalty, and who was blocking marriage equality in Maryland. And so I said, I'm going to run for the state senate. My favorite story about the race actually is the local paper had an article when I first announced, quoting a pundit who said Raskin's chances of victory are considered impossible. Okay, and then 9 months later, we got 67% of the vote. And then thank you. The Washington Post had an article quoting a pundit who said Raskin's victory was inevitable. So I got these two articles because the pundits are never wrong. One saying my victory was impossible, the other saying it was inevitable. And I like to teach the kids in our Democracy Summer project, more than 1,000 kids across the country doing this, that in politics, nothing's impossible and nothing's inevitable. It's only possible through the democratic arts of education and organizing and mobilizing people for change. But when I announced what I wanted to do, a woman came up to me after my speech and she said, Jamie, that was a great speech. This is in 2006. Did I love your speech? But one thing, take out all that stuff you've got in there about gay marriage, because it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. Even the gay candidates don't talk about it. And it makes you sound like you're really extreme, like you're not in the political center. And my 3 kids were there with me as I, recorded in my book, and they were watching to see how I would respond. And so the pressure was kind of on. I didn't want to offend her. I didn't have that many attendees with me that day at my kickoff. But I said, thank you for telling me that, because it makes me realize that it's not my goal to be in the political center, which blows around with the wind. It's my goal to be in the moral center, to try to find what's right the best we can, and then to bring the political center to us. And so I don't have any illusions that there are people equally sincerely and passionately motivated on the question of marriage equality. For example, J.D. Vance would overturn marriage equality for millions of people in the country. And I believe he's sincerely motivated out of his moral system, whatever it is. And I don't question that. But that's what politics is about, is trying to transform people's political morality. So he at least has to speak for why he would invalidate people's marriages or not allow people to get married. And I can say with my party that love equals love, and we should not be denying this essential right of citizenship to millions of our people because other people disapprove of it.
I shouldn't have the privilege of all the questions. I've got many more I want to ask, but let's open it up to the audience. Sean is out there with a microphone, so raise your hand and please, please, please keep your questions short. I'll jump in if you make them more than a sentence or too long, and I'll make them keep their answers short too. It's a deal, so we can get as many people in as possible.
Well, I was so also grateful for serving and for good people, rich in democracy, and well, so I want to go back to the question of curiosity about things of the common or
You want to go first? Just
Safety.
Well, let me say this. I was on the January 6th Select
Yeah.
Committee, and a bunch of our recommendations, because, you know, in politics, you're always fighting the last war, right? So we said things like the vice president, cannot step outside of his or her constitutional role and just proclaim the president to be president, even though the other candidate won by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. Now, we don't really need to do that because our vice president is Kamala Harris. I don't think that she's going to defy the rule of law in that way. Other things are going to be happening. But some of the simple physical precautions we recommended and have been made. I mean, it's sort of sad to talk about it, but you know, we've got much stronger glass in the windows so that they can't be broken. And we've fortified different parts of the Capitol complex. And I think that we will probably now take as a precaution getting the National Guard there on January 6th. That used to be a day of celebration, you know, the peaceful transfer of power. You know, what one of my colleagues on the Rules Committee told me, he'd been in Congress for 24 years, and the January 6th day was a day when all the drinks in the bars on Capitol Hill were half price, you know, and people would go out, it would take 10 minutes and everybody would go get drunk and celebrate. Now you can get killed on January the 6th. And that is, you know, part of the problem with the Electoral College. There are so many complicated nooks and crannies with the state Electoral College meeting in the state capitals and the certificates of ascertainment being issued by the governors, being sent to the Archivist of the United States and the Speaker of the House and the President's Senate, the joint session meeting, the objections and so on. Let's just have an election.
Yeah.
You know, we can have an election and we can make that happen. So, but look, I don't want to, I'm not in the false hope business. I think that political violence has obviously been unleashed in the country. And we saw it on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania, with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. We saw it with the attack on Steve Scalise. We saw it on January 6th, where more than 140 of our Capitol officers were assaulted and brutalized and hospitalized with Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, American flags. We saw it in the brutal attack on Paul Pelosi. We saw it in the assassination and kidnapping attempt against Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan by members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. So we need the political parties and the political leadership of America in a clear and unambiguous way to stand up and denounce political violence across the board in America.
There's a mic over there.
Someone has a microphone.
Go ahead. Can you hold the mic up a little closer?
What happens to the law?
I mean, it's a very good question. And I think, you know, sort of building on what Jamie said, we all have a lot of fears about the kind of political rhetoric, particularly from the former president who will go to his rallies and say, you know, we're not going to lose. And if we do, we're gonna fix that, or all the kind of, we saw what happened and what it led to. So I think we all have a lot of fears about that. But none of us are very good in the crystal ball prediction business. And ultimately, you know, our goal has to be to fight for what's right, to, you know, get the winning team to win, and, you know, do whatever we have to do when the day comes to, you know, certify the votes and everything else. I mean, we're all hoping we don't have that same scenario again. I think we'd be far better prepared. As you said, the National Guard will be there, the windows are thick. I mean, that was unprecedented, and people could hardly believe what was going on when it was happening. So I think it's a very good question, but I will just say this one thing. I think particularly because this is probably a room full of people who really thinks hard about this and talks to your friends about it. And we're also concerned about the future of the democracy. You know, who's the best candidate to win? What's going to happen? We occasionally can catch ourselves in a little bit of too much political gamesmanship, the sort of punditry, our self-punditry, and don't overthink this stuff. Like, everybody has a role to play. We're all just ourselves, even the elected officials. And you got to do exactly what you think is right. You got to convince your friends to do what you think is right. And there is a very good chance that good will triumph over evil. I mean, that's why I go to work every day, because I believe it eventually triumphs over evil, but not if we sit back and say, as Jamie said, oh, that can never happen. Oh, you know, let's game this out. Maybe I should, you know, maybe I as an individual politician should stand on the sidelines, you know, any of those things. But I think it's just true of all of us as individuals. So, you know, sometimes like we shouldn't overthink everything. We should be like, okay, I know the difference between right and wrong. I know what the moral center is. What should I be doing? What should I tell my friends I'm going to do? And just get out there and do it. And then we'll win, and we'll fix some of this stuff.
Yeah. Can I add one thing to that?
Yes.
I just on the, you know, what will happen to MAGA when Donald Trump loses? I mean, I will make a prediction. Although I'm with Chellie, like we're not in the prognostication business.
We're good at the prognosis.
Yeah, but we're in the mobilization business. Okay, so, but I believe that the Trump family has found a good grift and they don't want to let go. He put his niece in charge of the RNC. They've taken over the total financial apparatus. They're going to keep that going as long as they can. I believe that whoever is next, Donald Trump Jr. or J.D. Vance, whoever, will probably have to run against Liz Cheney for president. And one of those sides will win. And look, there's no magic of the two-party system. The Constitution doesn't mention political parties, much less a two-party system. The Republican Party began as a third party, displacing the Whigs, right? Because the Whigs would not commit on the slavery question, which was the authoritarianism, monarchy question of their time, right? And so I guess I would just say someone's going to win and someone's going to lose, and Liz might go out and create her own party. And if we can make her pro-choice, then she'll join the Democratic Party. But
I want to reinforce what Jamie said, because I do think like we're not in control with what happens in the Republican Party. All we can do is try to get the best candidate we can get in. But I think that we all fully believe that we are a better country when we have two strong parties that have a moral center. And we do have a family that has a good grift and are going to want to keep this going. But we also have a lot of really great colleagues like Liz Cheney and others who at some point are going to feel that tipping point and say, it's time to do that fight. It's time to take it back. We've lost another election. And so I want people to continue to be Republicans, and I want all those good Republicans who talk to me and say, I'm a good Republican and I'm not happy with what's going on, to be like, okay, well, now it's time for you to stand up and run for your county committee, or, you know, do all the things that you need to do to take it back, because that's where we're losing it, is a little bit at a time.
We're on a college campus, and I want to have a quick follow-up on this question of political violence. Do you think, and I want to pay tribute to your son, Tommy, as I say this, do you think we're at risk of alienating young people and not bringing them into public service because of the violence, because of the rhetoric, because of the safety worries? Or are they inspired?
Very much so. Look, political violence is a subset of violence generally, right? And this is why I got together where, you know, I'm the ranking Democrat on the oversight committee, and I got together with the Chairman Comer, after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. I said, we've got to categorically denounce political violence, which much to his credit, he joined me in doing, we did it together. But I said, there's two things we got to do. One, we got to get the Secret Service to clean up its act, and let's figure out what happened and why that rooftop 150 yards away from the stage was left completely open. And everybody's asking the same question. We got to get to the bottom of that. But there were 3 mass shootings on that day, on July 13th, 2024. The one in Butler, Pennsylvania was not even the worst mass shooting. The worst one was in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 people were killed and 10 people were seriously wounded. Okay, this has just become the norm that somehow we're conditioned to, that we're going to lose 30 or 35,000 Americans a year to gun violence and have mass shootings on average 1.5 or 2 times a day in America. So commonplace, the newspapers don't even cover it anymore unless it's in your community. And so, yeah, we can get the Secret Service to do a much better job protecting presidential candidates, but who's going to be protecting Americans in elementary schools, in the Walmart, in grocery stores, in churches, in synagogues, in mosques? And the young people are very fired up about it. And we have a colleague, Maxwell Frost from Florida, the youngest member of Congress. He's a wonderful young man. And he got involved in politics because of the gun violence issue at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School. Yeah.
Another question.
Donald Trump caused the White House moving service to $169 million damage to the Congress.
Yeah. There actually is a lawsuit to that effect. Our colleague Eric Swalwell and some of the police. Yeah, they brought that lawsuit, and it's still winding its way through the courts. You know, justice is slow, especially when it comes to Donald Trump. But you're right. Look, I mean, we haven't even talked about the Supreme Court today. You got to invite us back.
Right, yeah. At least one justice out here.
But I mean, here we've got explicit language in the Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, saying anyone who is sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, who violates the oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion, shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. Okay, that's in the Constitution. So the Supreme Court reads it out of the Constitution, and then they have something that doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, which is the president shall be immune from criminal prosecution, which would be a surprise to every other president, including President Ford, who pardoned Richard Nixon so he wouldn't be prosecuted. I mean, where did that doctrine come from? It's like the stork brought it, and they just read it into the Constitution. So, but I'm with you. I think that just as a matter of tort liability, that's a very serious question. But let's be clear, Donald Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives. Chellie and I voted on this for inciting an insurrection against the Constitution. And we had the most sweeping bipartisan vote in American history, 57-43, to convict Donald Trump of that. We've had 4 presidential trials in the Senate for impeachment in our history. Andrew Johnson, for his crimes against Reconstruction, he escaped conviction narrowly. Also, Bill Clinton for doing you know what. And then Donald Trump, who has 2 out of 4, 50% of the presidential trials for impeachment are Donald Trump. And it was a 57-43 vote, which he was very proud of, to have 57% of the Senate voting to convict him. And he's holding it up, brandishing it in public. Yes, acquitted by a 57-43 vote. I had to explain it to all the foreign reporters why that wasn't a conviction. And it's because of the 2/3 requirement in the Constitution.
Number of basically responsible for certifying the election if the Democrat were not going to certify. You get each set of states that are we won't certify it. Well, only election that the program that I was doing. What is the Congress doing?
Well, the Congress is doing nothing because, you know, Speaker Johnson is in control. But we've got a very fine lawyer. His name is Mark Elias, who is just going state by state, as we must do, in our electoral federalism to try to defend the integrity of the election and the right to vote against all of the shenanigans. And it is going to, that is, you put your finger on it, that's where the action is going to be at the state level, where they are going to try, look, I think this is going to be a landslide election, but obviously I'm not exactly objective about it. But I do think it's going to be a landslide election. I think it needs to be a landslide election because it's got to be so big they can't steal it, right? And so, but we understand what to expect, and we will have the lawyers there on the ground. But the judiciary is a very mixed bag at this point, as we know, and the final destination is not an enviable one for any of the lawyers in any of these cases.
I think we maybe have a question back there.
I used to work for Thomas Office here before I got there. I want to know what we done about it, and they started writing to me and take care of it. And he went out.
Okay,
And he made great points.
Chellie.
Yeah, and when I first came to Congress, I had been running Common Cause, the national president of it, for 4 years, and actually done some work with Jamie back in the old days. And looking at these fundamental questions of democracy, that was right about when Congress passed McCain-Feingold, which really quickly became obsolete, and we started working on trying to pass a bill related to public financing, which Maine has been fairly successful at. It's gotten, a little less effective after the Supreme Court decision that said money isn't politics, and outside, PACs and 501c4s and super PACs and all these other groups can sort of have more influence than the individual voters spending. So we need a new Supreme Court, or we need a Supreme Court that's going to reverse that decision and not look at money as free speech. And like so many fundamental things where the underpinnings are being taken away from us, that was one of the early, I think, very bad decisions. We also, I think, are in a slightly different place. And if we were ever back in the position of having perhaps Democratic control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, we could move forward a fairly significant election reform bill that would include that, the John Lewis bill. The bills that we've proposed are all there. But I will say, when I first got to Congress, and this is how everyone evolves, I had to butt heads with some Democrats just as much as some Republicans, because when you think the system is working okay for you, or I'm good at raising money, or here's how we do it, your traditional players can sometimes be like, well, I don't want to do that public financing and I don't want to be limited. I think it's so far out of hand now. We'd have, just like we do in sort of healthcare reform or the cost of housing, or so many things now are so out of whack, the gap between the rich and the poor, all those things. There's a better sense of why we have to fix it and bring it back into equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, the influence of the outside players, back again, if you're in the oil and gas industry or you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you do not want to take away the power of money in politics. That is how you are helping to control who's in power in Congress. So I think we would need a very strong majority, but I think at some point, if we could win this election and then just try to right this ship again and really go after some of these fundamental things like gerrymandering and, many things. And believe me, we can send you the bills. We got proposals on the table. This isn't like a new idea, but you got to have the votes to pass it. And right now we really don't. And with Republican control in the House, we don't even have the votes to make Congress win for the most part. So.
What a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Chellie, Pingree, and Jamie Raskin. It's just a delight to have you here on the college campus.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Can I just, before the president takes over, I just want to give one special thank you to Jamie for coming to Maine.
Yeah.
He's a busy man. You guys would have been sleeping halfway through this if it was just me answering the questions, and he brings such a wealth of information, dedication, personal commitment. He's everybody's favorite member of Congress. And don't get me wrong, the Republicans love him too. They all do it. And It's a really nice thing for him to be here. Thank you. Probably have hand over to you.
To my mind, that was a perfect session to end our week. Before we move for reception in the Gara Oval in front of the Davis Center for Student Policy, I want to acknowledge that this institute wouldn't exist without Bill Gordon. Bill has care of planning to meet each and every year since the institute's inception, always pushing and prodding us to better, be better, and stretch further. And I thank all of you, our friends and donors. The Summer Institute wouldn't be possible without your continued support. In fact, a number of folks have come up to me this week and said, how can I help? You know who you are. I thank you. We welcome you to the district. I know you enjoyed our campus this week. All of the Atlantic situated along Freshman Bay on beautiful grounds with a terrace tour of students, staffers, and faculty. Maybe this is special fun. But as beautiful as the campus is, that beauty runs deeper than the size of the campus. It extends to the culture that we embrace in our educational enterprise. Everybody, please take time to learn more about this college. It's a remarkable education. I've spent my life in higher ed, and I've seen many schools and examples, and I can tell you what we have here is unique and progressive. Not in the political sense, but in the forward-looking sense. And so very important. This is the education that young adults deserve. And we'd be happy to share what we do in any young college. And finally, save the date next year, July 28th, August 1st.
Thank you.